Chapter 9. Stephen squinted as the morning sun hit the windshield. They'd pulled up abruptly along a busy shopping strip, just back from the entrance to La Grosseria, the Italian deli where Brian worked. Even with his limited vision, he could make out a steady stream of customers coming and going, and he watched with interest as a young man, wearing a red apron over smart brown trousers and a striped shirt, diligently trotted behind an elderly woman, his arms straining under the weight of 2 large brown paper shopping bags. "You don't see that kind of service much these days," he murmured, as the man waved to the customer before returning to the store. Morton didn't reply. Stephen turned to see his colleague was busy wrestling with whatever was stuck in his left nostril. "That's disgusting. Do that in your own time." "This is my own time, and it's also my car," Morton continued unperturbed. With an exaggerated huff, Stephen unclipped his seatbelt and climbed out, before standing at the edge of the gutter. He hated being paired with Morton, and he was worried that the arrival of the new homicide detectives would make it a reoccurring event. "Come on." He banged on the windscreen. Begrudgingly, Morton emerged, propping his right hand on the open car door to help lever himself up and out of the front seat. A bell above the door jingled as they entered La Grosseria. Stephen was shocked to find that the small shop front hid a huge, cavernous interior, which continued as far as his eyes could see. "Oh my goodness," he muttered, realizing that he'd grossly underestimated the Mancini family's business. He'd been picturing a small specialty grocer, selling meats, cheeses, and maybe some pasta. But this was more like a massive warehouse, and it was stocked floor to ceiling with tantalizing goods. Along the far wall, Stephen could see shelves lined with mineral water, imported beer, wine, and spirits. He began wandering through various aisles, his stomach rumbling as he spied artisan pastas, cold-pressed olive oils, gourmet sauces, Ligurian pesto, preserved black truffles from Tuscany. It was heaven. "Can you believe how big this place is?" he asked, assuming Morton was following behind. When he got no answer, he spun around, discovering that he'd lost his colleague somewhere back behind rows of sauces and balsamic vinegars. He wandered a bit longer, mentally checking off all the items he'd like to buy, before making his way to the end of the aisles, where the space opened up into a large food court. There, Stephen found Morton leaning against a glass display, openly ogling a fully stocked deli, which peddled specialties such as San Daniele prosciutto, capicola, and other Italian meats. "What's bresaola?" Morton barked at a brunette woman behind the counter. "How about we find Brian before we start ordering lunch?" Stephen snapped, resisting the urge to tug on the detective's sleeve to pull him away. Down the back, past an in-house cheesemonger, a barista was serving coffee. "Hi," Stephen smiled, once the man had finished helping a young mother. "I'm First Constable Carter, and this is my colleague, Detective Williams. We're here to speak with Brian Gibson." The barista didn't bat an eyelid. "He's just out the back. You can go and have a look if you want, but I don't think he'll be long." "Thanks." Stephen paused. "Actually, while we've got you, were you working last Friday?" "Yep. I work Monday to Friday here." "And do you remember if Brian was working that day?" The barista propped 2 small cups on saucers and hit a bell on the counter. "Yes, he would have been working. He's here most days." "Can you remember what time you saw him at the store? Was he here all day?" "I don't know." The man's voice was curt now, and he winced as he burnt his hand on the hot steam that escaped from his espresso machine. "You can see how big this place is, and I'm usually stuck behind this counter. You'd be better to ask him." "Okay, thanks. We will." Tucked in the far corner, past freezers full of pre-prepared meals, was a small doorway, covered by a curtain of plastic PVC strips. "Mr. Gibson?" Stephen called out as he pushed through. Natalie's husband was bent over a large freezer. "Sorry to intrude." Stephen took another step forward. Brian jumped, cursing as he dropped a big bag of frozen prawns. His eyes were wide, but the puffy, sagging skin that framed them gave him the appearance of being half asleep. "What's happened?" He darted nervous looks between the two police officers. "Has something happened? Have you found her?" "No, it's nothing like that. There's nothing to be alarmed about," Stephen said, noticing that Morton had wandered off again. "We just want to take a look at the shop and have a quick chat when you're free." Brian shrugged, slamming the freezer closed as he led the way back out to the food court. "There's not much to see. This is it," he said, impassively waving a hand as though he were a real estate agent guiding unlikely buyers through a property. "It's very impressive. Are you always so busy?" Brian snorted. "Some days it's busy, some days it's not. I want to put a wine bar in, but I'm having trouble with the licensing laws. And Natalie's parents." "Your wife's parents are still quite involved, are they?" "They don't come here much, but they still have a lot of say in the decisions. Too much say, if you ask me." "And what about Natalie herself?" Stephen asked gently. "Did she ever come here?" "Of course, but not often. She's never been that interested in the business side of things." "I see. Do you have time to sit down with us?" Brian seemed to be considering refusing the request before gesturing to the barista at the coffee stand. "Go and tell Harry what you want. I need a coffee anyway." To Stephen's frustration, Morton followed Brian over to a small table, leaving him the job of ordering their drinks. As he waited at the counter, a security camera caught his eye. He did a quick scan of the room and saw there were several cameras, each positioned to capture a different angle. "How are you holding up, mate?" he heard Morton ask as he teetered over, awkwardly balancing a tray with 3 mugs. "It's been 5 days since my wife vanished, and I've heard nothing. How do you think I'm holding up?" "What about the children?" Stephen sat down, pushing a coffee towards Brian. "Are they doing okay?" To his surprise, the mention of the children seemed to strike a nerve, and Brian turned away, wiping his eyes. "Of course not. But I don't know what to do. They keep asking for their mum, and I keep telling them she'll be back soon. What else can I say?" Morton slurped his coffee noisily. "Looks like it's rough work, what you do." Stephen followed his colleague's gaze. The wound he and Emmett had seen on Brian's hand 2 days ago was starting to heal over, revealing small scars in his left palm. Brian bristled. "Of course it's rough work. Do you see how many pallets I have to sort through? Do you have any idea how much upkeep a place like this takes? I spend my life in this fucking deli." The gruff voice of Natalie's husband seemed to echo around the store, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Thankfully, the tension was broken by the arrival of Harry, the barista, with a plate of pastries. "Fresh cannoli," he said, seemingly oblivious to the awkward moment he'd just intruded upon. "Thought you might like some, boss." Brian managed a smile, which sank as the young worker walked away. Morton reached forward and grabbed a brown pastry, crunching into the buttery flakes noisily. That's pretty good." The detective licked a clump of cream off his lips. "I have to get back to work." Brian stood up. "We have a big order coming in today, and I need to clear space on the shelves." "That's fine," Stephen said. "We'll head off soon too. But do you mind if we speak to some of the other staff? I imagine a few of them would have known Natalie. and we're trying to get as much detail on her as we can. Knock yourselves out. Great. And one other thing. Brian pushed his chair back into the table with a force that made the crockery shake. What? We noticed you have security cameras in the store. We'd like to have a look through the footage from last Friday, the day your wife disappeared. Natalie's husband blinked several times before answering. Why? She didn't come in here. Maybe not, but we need to see who else was around. It's important we get as full a picture of that day as possible. The shop's got nothing to do with my wife disappearing. Brian shook his head. And anyway, the cameras don't work. What? They don't work. They never have. They're just those pretend cameras that we put up to deter shoplifters. They don't record anything. Stephen looked to his colleague for help, but Morton simply shrugged as Brian huffed off. Why do you care about the security cameras? Morton eventually asked, dusting icing sugar off his hands. It's unlikely his wife came in here, isn't it? Stephen craned his neck to check that Natalie's husband was well out of earshot. I don't think she came in here, but we're meant to be checking whether Brian really did work all day, as he claims. Remember? Well, that's easy then. Morton picked at a flake of pastry that was sitting on the table. Let's just come back with a warrant and seize the footage. Stephen had to resist the urge to pick up the empty plate and throw it right at his colleague's face. Didn't you hear him? He said there is no footage. The cameras are fake. They don't record anything. An odd look crossed Morton's face. His stomach began jiggling, then his whole body shook as he broke into hearty laughter. Oh, you really are naive, aren't you? He jeered, tugging at his sweater, which had inched its way up his chest and was dangerously close to exposing rolls of flab. Didn't you see that glass office out the back, in the corner of the storeroom? Stephen frowned, vaguely remembering something. He'd been more preoccupied by Brian and his large bag of prawns. I think so. And didn't you see what was set up there, above the desk? All the security monitors on the computer screens? There were at least 6 different feeds playing out live footage. Stephen felt his face drop. He hadn't seen that. No wonder they haven't made you a detective yet. Morton laughed again, before taking an unnecessarily noisy slurp of the last of his coffee. He stood up, giving his young colleague a patronising pat on the head. You really need to improve your observation skills, my boy. The cameras are definitely working. It had been a painfully slow commute back out to Flemington, thanks to the morning peak hour rush, and as Emmett pulled up to the curb of the wide, tree-lined street, he noticed Bianca hastily unclip her seatbelt. You're keen? I need to get out of this car. Bianca flung her door open dramatically. I think my legs have gone to sleep. Emmett murmured his agreement as he joined her on the nature strip, extending his arms out wide as he stretched his back. The mood had been sombre since leaving the office of DGP Finance. There was always something sobering about watching someone's last moments caught on camera, when they blissfully wandered off to an untimely death. And neither detective had said much on the drive to Tom Norman's nursing home. That's a cracking garden, isn't it? Bianca pointed ahead. They were standing in front of a sprawling white complex, surrounded by Australian natives and shrubbery. To their left, a large eucalyptus tree stood proudly, and Emmett watched with bemusement as his new colleague snapped off a thin branch and sniffed the leaves. You didn't strike me as a gardening enthusiast. I like plants, Bianca said, a little defensively. And it's good they've made this area so green. It doesn't look like a nursing home, does it? They've done a good job. Let's wait until we see inside. Though he was keen to learn more about Rosemary's brother, The thought of being in an aged care facility made Emmett anxious. The last time he'd been to one of these places was as a junior officer, when he'd watched an elderly man urinate in the middle of a dining hall. The staff had been so slow to react that he'd felt compelled to assist the distressed man himself. It had been both humbling and horrifying to help a complete stranger change underwear. "Detective," Bianca prompted, leading the way up a wide concrete ramp. "Right." Emmett followed, pausing at the top to hold the door open for a woman with a walking frame. There was no one at the reception, so Bianca pressed a buzzer and the two detectives waited, each scanning the sterile building. "Can I help you?" A large woman in a beige shirt appeared. She seemed remarkably unperturbed by the unexpected arrival of the detectives and swiftly pushed over a ratty visitor book. "Sign here, and then you can go through." "Do you mind if we have a quick look through this?" Emmett said, after he'd taken the liberty of signing for both himself and Bianca. "Of course." Flicking through the pages, it was clear that the facility wasn't exactly overrun with visitors, and the few signatures that were there repeated often, though some were so scrawled and messy they were near impossible to decipher. "Is that Daniel's name there?" Emmett pointed to a black, circular scribble. "I think so. He seems to come in pretty regularly. And that looks like it might be Rosemary's name? But I don't know what that signature says." Bianca had her finger under a different line, which was dated 10th of July. "It looks like Tom had a couple of visitors that day. Maybe Rosemary met someone here?" Emmett rubbed his forehead before lowering his voice. "But so what? Even if she came here 3 weeks ago, that doesn't help us. The last place we know she was alive was Friday evening, almost a fortnight ago when she left that finance company. Unless she came here that night or on the weekend following, which she didn't, according to this logbook, we still have no idea where she was or who she was with." Bianca nodded. "Let's get a copy of these pages and keep going. I'm keen to see what Tom Norman is like." After receiving their photocopied pages, the detectives were soon walking through corridor after corridor, following behind a young man who had been introduced as the morning manager. "This is our dining facility." The man stopped, gesturing to his left as though a flight attendant pointing out safety features in an aeroplane. Emmett and Bianca dutifully nodded as they viewed the empty room. "It's quite early for our guests." The man continued their tour. "We may find Mr. Norman is still asleep, or he may be having breakfast in his room." Emmett discreetly looked at his watch. It was almost 11 a.m. "How long has Tom been at this facility?" he asked, as they arrived in front of a white door with the number 26 on it. The morning manager chuckled, as though this was particularly funny. "Oh, I'd have to check. But it would be at least 15 years. Probably more. There was a short window where he was being looked after by his brother, but that didn't last long. He was back before we'd even offered his room to another guest." He pressed the intercom. Emmett looked at Bianca, who appeared less and less sprightly by the second. His colleagues seemed to be having the same thought. How could this be the best place for a man in his late 30s? Surely there were better ways to look after disabled adults. A woman in a white carer's uniform opened the door. "Hi, Con." She nodded to the morning manager before looking questioningly to Emmett and Bianca. "These are 2 police officers," the manager said. "They want to see Mr. Norman. Is he up?" "Yes, he's just having breakfast." The woman smiled at the detectives. "I thought you might be media. Tom's a bit of a rock star around here since that article." "Article?" "Yes, it came out only a couple of weeks ago. A reporter and photographer came from the paper. They did a lovely feature on Tom, to commemorate 30 years since his family's accident. Emmett felt his skin tingle. I'd love to see that. We have copies in his bedside drawer. We were keeping spares for any visitors. Come in. The room was small, far too small to hold 5 people, and Emmett wished the manager would have the good grace to step outside. Tom, the carer cooed. There are some nice police officers here to see you. Do you want to say hello? Emmett shuffled forward slightly, unsure whether it would be inappropriate to extend a hand. Tom was in his chair, a bib placed around his neck, and a tray of mushy cereal in front of him. Do you mind if I keep feeding him? The woman asked. I have several other people waiting, and I'm running a bit late. You can have a look at the article while I finish up. The carer pointed to a small bedside table. It should be in the first drawer. Reaching over to the table, Emmett was careful not to knock an obviously homemade photo frame, from which 2 primary school-aged boys beamed out happily. That must be Tom and Daniel, when they were young. Sliding open the drawer, he brushed aside a beaded wooden bracelet and retrieved one of the black and white copies. The article was published on Monday, the 8th of July, by reporter Lizzie Davis. Today's the 24th, is that right? Emmett turned to Bianca, who flicked her phone on. Sure is. Turning back to the article, Emmett scanned the first few paragraphs. It was, in essence, a fluff piece. Flowery words written about a young boy whose life was tragically altered in a car accident. Tom Norman was just 8 years old when tragedy tore his world apart. A horrific car accident took the lives of his 2 parents and left him severely brain damaged. Doctors believed he would not make it to his 16th birthday. Now, as the 30-year anniversary approaches, we look back at that terrible day and ask, how has he managed to survive? A striking photo of Tom sitting in his wheelchair, staring out over the nursing home gardens, took up most of the page. Miracle Man, the caption read. Emmett looked up to see the carer carefully spooning another large mouthful of cereal between Tom's teeth, before encouraging him to swallow. There didn't seem anything too miraculous about this poor man's life. Why did the paper want to mark 30 years since the accident? He asked. It was one of those tragedies that you just couldn't forget. The carer continued to coax spoonfuls of mush into Tom's unwilling mouth. And it was a big deal for the neighbourhood at the time. I grew up around here and remember it myself. Local politicians even got involved, and the government changed the signalling laws around train stations after that. The crash was around here? Emmett asked, surprised. What actually happened? It was somewhere up on Racecourse Road, just as you head towards North Melbourne. Oh, it was awful, wasn't it, Tom? The woman paused, placing the breakfast bowl down and gently clasping her client's hands. Emmett felt a lump form in his throat. It felt wrong to be talking like this in front of Rosemary's brother. He continued to skim through the article instead, pausing as his eyes fell on the detail he was after. It's believed the children's father didn't notice an oncoming train as he crossed the Upfield railway line near Macaulay Station. The family's car was struck, and both he and his wife died instantly. Tom, who was seated in the back between his 2 siblings, was critically injured. Between his 2 siblings? Emmett muttered out loud. Bianca looked at him questioningly, but he shook his head. It was better to discuss this outside. Yes, it's terribly sad. But you're doing well now, aren't you? The carer patted Tom's hands before laboriously lifting the tray of crockery over his head and squeezing past the visitors. I need to move on to some other patients now, but it was nice meeting you both. Once the carer had left, Emmett shuffled closer to Tom's chair. He could see large chunks of food were caught on the man's lips. A strange anxiousness rose in his chest. Should I wipe his face for him? Hi, Tom. I'm Detective Corbin, he said, moving in a little more so that he sat directly opposite. We're very sorry about what's happened to your sister, and we're working hard to find the person responsible. At the mention of Rosemary, Tom's hands flailed up and down. Is there any way you can tell us if your sister came to visit you much? Did you see her before she disappeared? The man's head swayed slightly, but Emmett couldn't tell if he was trying to say yes or no, or whether it was simply an involuntary movement. He can't communicate, the morning manager said, unhelpfully. I imagine you were very close to Rosemary, Emmett continued. And your brother, Daniel. He came to see you a lot, didn't he? Tom's hands waved wildly and his body shook, so that some of the mashed food that had been stuck to his lips now dribbled down his chin. Emmett couldn't take it anymore. Reaching over to a box of tissues, he wiped the man's face, then took one of the flailing hands between his palms. The pressure of his grip seemed to calm Tom, who settled back down. Did you enjoy having Daniel come to visit you? Tom's movements were gentler now, but his mouth was vibrating, a strange, sad gargling noise coming from his throat. Saliva dribbled down his chin. This isn't good for him. I don't want him becoming distressed. I hope you understand. The manager edged forward. Emmett nodded, but continued anyway. Is there anything we should know about your sister's passing? Perhaps she told you about a man she was meeting? Something like that? This time there was no denying it. Tom was trying to respond. His head moved vigorously, and his arms jerked so erratically that his whole upper body shuddered. Without thinking, Emmett found himself leaning over, wrapping the sad man in a tight hug. When he released Tom, he saw that his eyes were weeping. I think it's best if you leave now. The manager's voice was firm. Mr. Norman needs rest, and I'm afraid he's not able to help you with your questions, but I'm happy to fill you in on whatever I can. Okay, thanks for your time. Emmett stood up, aware he was becoming agitated, but unable to decide why. It was a pleasure to meet you, Tom. We'll be back to visit you again soon. The trio walked to the foyer in silence, Bianca now scanning the article that Emmett had passed her. I wonder why Daniel never mentioned that both he and Rosemary were in the car when it crashed, she whispered, once they were back out in the foyer. That's what I'm wondering too, Emmett said, before turning back to the morning manager, who was hovering awkwardly. Was it only family who came to visit Mr. Norman here? I believe so. The man smiled sadly. He didn't have many visitors. His brother Daniel was the most regular guest here. I see. Thank you. As they walked back down the wide ramp at the front of the complex, another thought occurred to Emmett. Do you know where Macaulay Station is? He turned to Bianca. The carer said the crash happened around here, but I've never heard of that train stop. Bianca frowned. I think it's in North Melbourne, or maybe that area's been rezoned as the Docklands these days. I'm not sure. This isn't my side of town. Emmett pulled out his phone. As the little blue dot appeared on the map on his screen, his eyes widened. What is it? Bianca leant over as Emmett pinched the screen to zoom in. Oh my God. He blinked several times before checking he was seeing things correctly. It's almost directly opposite where Rosemary's body was found. Bianca took the phone and inspected it for herself. It's east of the Moonee Ponds Creek, on the upfield line, between North Melbourne and Flemington Bridge. Yes, you're right. It's an easy walking distance from where she was found. Emmett nodded, biting his lower lip as his mind spun. Rosemary was dumped near the scene of her family tragedy just a fortnight after an article about the crash was published. He paused, locking eyes with his colleague, his mouth suddenly dry. Well, that can't be a coincidence, can it?